Okay,
Okay.
welcome to Atmosoft Tech Talks, a live show where we discuss everything you need to know about software development and technology in business. I'm Natasha, your host, and joining me today is our COO, Bill, a solutions architect at Atmosoft. Hi, Bill. Thank you for joining us today.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Fantastic. So, today we will be discussing the basics of documentation. So, if you're ready, we can just dive right into it.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, fantastic. So, the first question that we have is could you explain what exactly is meant by documentation in the context of software development?
Yeah, sure. So one of the ideas behind documentation is a way to uh, it's primarily a means of communication. So a lot of times you need to take into consideration what the communication about the project is going to be over the long term. And I think that's a lot of what a lot of people don't think about is yes, we have the code. Yes, the code is kind of self-documenting, but it's good to have some documentation outside of that to bring people up to speed quickly and to provide communication about the system. You know, what are the business rules? What are the pieces in play with the particular system. So in terms of software, and we kind of got away from it because one of the and I think we'll discuss this later, but one of the one of the one of the founding ideas behind agile was communication over documentation, which is essentially kind of communicating with the team members and everyone being on the same page about what's going on and not necessarily documenting that. Where I believe that model particularly fails is when we're bringing in new team members, or we lose core team members, or in our particular situation, we're working for a company that does development as a service, and that the anticipation is this company is going to come in, our company's going to come in, we're going to do some work, and then we're going to leave. And so we especially need to be more communicative, over communicative, and that's where the documentation piece comes in play. Is we need to the stakeholders and the people who are going to maintain the system after us need to understand what we did and why.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I agree. I think documentation is very important, even if you aren't working with a company like ours, because there's no telling, like, a developer might move, and then you might not have been doing documentation from up until that point. And then when you have new developers coming in, there's this big gap of knowledge of like the person having to learn the code, and it goes by a lot faster if there's documentation for them to read.
Yeah, that's usually when I come into a new project or I'm looking into new source code. That's usually what I'll do first. I may not necessarily, if there's thousands of pages of documentations, I may not read everything, but I'm going to go to the documentation and try to get a good high level overview of what's going on and what are the components in play in a particular system. And I've worked for many companies where you come in and they're just afraid to touch this one particular piece because it's been around for so long. So many developers have touched it. It's kind of 99% working okay. They got kind of 1% problem, but no one wants to go in there and touch that because no one understands what's going on and no one wants to, take the time, break it out, document it, and do that kind of thing. And that can be, there should, just like a car, if you're a car mechanic, there shouldn't be any part of the system that you should have active fear of going in and touching. I understand that there's mission critical pieces to a system, but at any point in time, you should feel comfortable that you have enough of an understanding to go in and go in and work with that. And I think the key to that is documentation.
Yeah, I would agree. So our next question is many people seem to underestimate the importance of documentation. Can you explain why it's crucial?
Yeah.
Or
So we go back to communication,
yeah.
and the other thing is in documentation we can capture the ideas around the system. Sometimes that gets lost. If I have a legacy system that's been around for 10 years, we don't necessarily understand the original intent of the system, and sometimes there's critical information in there on why the system came to be, why it evolved the way it did, why we have these particular modules, what purpose this application or these individual components are serving for the business. And then I think that's all communicated with documentation. And I think it becomes even more critical. Again, we talk about this a lot with legacy systems, right? Because at this point, you've had multiple people, maybe multiple managers, multiple CTOs over, the term of a decade. I don't know many developers. Actually, that's not entirely true. I know a few, but most developers, work for an organization for a period of time, and then they move on to the next stage in their career, or the next opportunity, or the next development stack that they would like to work in. And so getting all that documentation together and having it available. And that's another thing too, is one of the things that happens a lot of times is people lose the documentation. So there's arguments about storing it in your repo with your code base, and I've heard both sides of it, and I tend to fall on the, I'm just going to check them and then I can give version control on the documents. I'm sure there's better systems to do that I'm just not aware of, but one of the key components is capturing the kind of the meta about the project, and that becomes critical in understanding if you're going to change a major piece of the system. You really need to understand the why and a little bit of the evolution of where that software is today. Like, why did this invoicing component come in? It came in because we didn't have any other way to generate PDFs to send to the customer. So that was the reason, right? And so you work with that, and that's one of the reasons why it's kind of critical. It's more for not necessarily for yourself right now, but for yourself in the future. That's code comments come in, that's a form of documentation too. And if you do good code comments, actually you can extract that out of the code using tools and kind of get some kind of a rough draft documentation. But I leave notes for myself in code all the time, especially if I do something a little bit tricky, right? That's a form of documentation, because later on, when I come back to touch that code 6 months after I haven't been thinking about it, I'm going to come in and look at it and go, why did I do that?
Yeah.
And then you fix it, and then you introduce a bug because it was working the way it was supposed to, but you didn't understand what the rule was, or there wasn't any documentation around why that choice was made.
Yeah. Like, maybe there was a reason why you did it the other way than the maybe stereotypical way of doing it. But because you didn't document it, you're like, why did I do it in this weird way? And then you try to do it the other way and it breaks it.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, our next question is, can you walk us through the different types of documentation, like technical documentation and user documentation and system documentation?
Sure. So we'll start with technical documentation. Technical documentation kind of encompasses a broad area. Actually, they all encompass a broad area. So technical documentation is going to be, what is my systemic architecture? What does my system look like as a whole? How many pieces are in play? And that could be something like, okay, I have a web server with a deployed web application. I have a database. That's a simple one. And it could be something as complex as, I have 10 web servers. Each one of them is hosting their own API, and these APIs do these various things. And then we have an API management layer, which, kind of consolidates all of our microservices. And we're talking to these 10 machines, and we're receiving files in this S3 bucket on Amazon. And we got all these different pieces in play, and just having a broad understanding of that is good. And then you move into code documentation, which I've done both of these, where some teams will go just, every function in the system is in the documentation. I don't believe you need to go that far. I believe that Agile's original manifesto had kind of a good idea with communication over documentation, which is kind of a good idea. But I think more of kind of a hybrid approach needs to be taken to it. So you don't have to go to the level of documenting what every function does. I mean, the code can kind of speak for itself, but you need to document the critical components or the modules inside of, your monolith or your microservice or whatever architecture you're using. You need to hit that at a high level and say, okay, we have an invoicing system, we have a UI, we have a database, we're storing this type of information, this kind of thing. And so the systemic documentation, which is your high level architecture view, your some code documentation, some database documentation around that, and then also good comments in your code is always going to be helpful, because a lot of times too, a lot of developers will just dive into the code. And that's not necessarily a bad way, but I kind of like to see it from a different level first before I kind of dive down into the detailed bits. What was the second one? So
The
technical.
second one was end user documentation.
Okay, so end user documentation is critical if you have a software package you're selling. So if you have QuickBooks, and this is most likely not going to be done by the development team or the architect, right? You're going to hire a technical writer, and they're going to come in and they're going to write all of your documentation on how the system operates. If I need to add a record, or if I need to add a user, or that's the end user kind of documentation. That's the help file when you go to a website, you're trying to like restream, and you're trying to figure out how to use a particular feature, like have the cool video clip come up in the beginning, right? That's all going to be written by a technical writer, and that's going to be included in your end user documentation. What you're not going to have is really any of your systemic or technical documentation in there, unless you're hosting an API. At which point you kind of get a hybrid type application. So I have an open, maybe not an open API. I have a service that I'm providing that's being fed via an API. For example, a Venn decoder, right? There's a company called, I believe their name is Data One, that basically has an API that you can hit to decode VINs and return back vehicle information, right? So instead, that's a lot of work. That's a ton of work to get all the new models, all the new trims, all the new VINs. And so a lot of companies outsource that particular area, which is a great business model to do. I'm just going to consume, someone else is going to do all that work. I'm just going to consume their result, and I'm going to pay for it. And so in that case, you're writing more of a technical document, so that people can integrate with you easier. And again, it's all about, who is my target audience? One of them is going to be the end user, and the other one is going to be technical people that are going to consume your implementation. And so knowing your audiences kind of helps you direct those particular documents in the right way.
Okay, and then the final one was system documentation.
Okay, yeah. So that goes back to this also crosses a little bit of a boundary, because you'll have your system documentation, which is all the individual components and pieces of your application, and that may also include networking type information from the networking team. So they may when they're drawing it up, okay, we got a firewall here, we're using a VPN connection, you have to do this, you have to do that. And the systemic documentation in this aspect is more of just like, what does it look like overall from a technical field? So I kind of talked that on the solutions architecture side. I think there's a slight difference in this one, in that we may also include information relevant from the networking side of things that can affect our application. And you may also be documenting permissions and various user accounts that are associated with running maybe some external processes, or we changed the IIS user to this, and this person has this level of permissions, so they can write outside of the website directory. And so this is the place where we would put all that information. So the idea behind this type of particular documentation would be, if I had to rebuild my infrastructure from scratch, let's just say you had a catastrophic failure and you had to rebuild your infrastructure from scratch, this particular document should capture all the pieces that you need and anything that is non-standard in the setup. So if I created a new user and gave that user certain permissions, and then I don't have that documented anywhere, if I had to rebuild my environment, I would have to kind of stumble into that one, and I wouldn't just immediately know, okay, I need to create a user that has permissions to write to this other directory.
Yep. Okay. And then what are some of the best practices for writing good documentation?
So number one, I think having when I start a project, having a broad overview of what our ideal or what our original thinking is on the project, and that includes the system, our overall architecture, any coding standards that we want to make sure get followed, when to use certain components. That could be something is like, okay, if you're doing this type of work, it needs to be an Azure function so we can reuse it in other places, and they need to be set up like this, and they need to have these permissions, and you go ahead and you kind of give a rough outline, and then you go and you do the actual work. What I see a lot, what I used to see a lot before Agile kind of rolled in, was we would try to do all of this stuff up front, user stories, features, and all that kind of work, and we would just try to do everything all up front, and then we'd go hide for 9 months and then come back out, and usually you're missing your target, right? That was one of the benefits of, and one of the things that kind of drove the agile adoption of the long in the industry, right? Because we were kind of going away for a while and then come back, and the business change, requirements change, and then you're just never quite getting it right. And so the goal is we want to start our documentation where we outline our standards, our what we're going to do, our technical approach, and anything else, again, like coding standards and those kind of things. And then we go in and we start doing the work, and we're going to do the work by putting good comments in our code,
Mhm.
and evolve. And then once you'll see this in software development at the beginning, things are changing super rapidly all through the system, right? You're putting together, you're smacking up some UI pages, you're getting your API kind of tweaked out. You're okay, I need this call for whatever reason, I'm going to add this function. Eventually the broad systemic changes start to die down, right? Eventually you start diving into core areas. Oh, I want to get the add new customer page completed, right? And then you're working on very, not granular, but very modular. You're working on modular pieces of the system, and you're
Mhm.
kind of flushing them out. Eventually you get to kind of like a stabilization phase. That could be alpha, it could be a beta phase, you can call it whatever you want, but eventually the system stops changing as rapidly. At that point, then we're going to go back in and we're going to flush out the rest of the documentation. We're going to update our architecture, because I'm guarantee you there'll be changes. Mike Tyson has a famous quote: "Everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face." And I love that quote. I think it is genius. All credit to Mike Tyson. Like, that's an excellent way to phrase it. And the same thing
Yeah.
happens in software development, right? We all have a plan until we get into the detail, and then we realize Redis can't do this one thing, or Kafka doesn't stream this message correctly because we're over the size limit, and so you start making these tweaking. So you want to go back and you want to update your documentation, and then you want to flush it out with a little more detail again, not down to the granular level. I do agree with Agile, or with the Agile manifesto in that regard, because in the beginning I didn't like documentation.
Yeah.
It seemed like you would write it and then it would immediately be invalid.
Yeah.
Everything would change. No one was going in and updating it. Eventually you have this dead document that is just not worthwhile for anybody to read, because the system doesn't resemble anything that you documented up front, right? So you have to go through this phase where you do a little bit up front, kind of sketch out your ideas, get everything in place, and then you kind of move over into, once your system starts stabilizing, then you can start nailing down some documentation. Again, I'm not saying go crazy on it, but you want to document anything that would be relevant for someone coming in as a consultant, or some new employee would be able to come in and read that, or even for the executives, right? So they can come in and they can kind of understand all the moving parts involved in the system. So that's kind of the approach I take to doing documentation. There is a little bit of a pause there where your main focus is on development. And then as you get closer to the end, then you can come back in and you could say, okay, here's the actual architecture we ended up with. Instead of 2 Azure functions, we have 8. They're doing this different piece. We have, instead of 1 web server, we're using 3. And instead of going with the relational data model, we went with the NoSQL model, because we wanted to store documents. And, after some iteration testing, we moved away from wanting to store everything in a relational database. So, and then you get all those ideas captured. And then make sure that, as your system has major changes or updates, you're going in, and part of that process is keeping the documentation up to date, which it is a burden, but that is one of the things we have to do in maintenance. A lot of times, customers will release and they'll have a product out there, and the product goes through significant shifts in change or significant changes in the architecture or feature set or something like that. And we don't go back and say, hey, listen, let's make sure our document's up to date, so we're not, telling people information that's completely invalid. I don't like the idea of having a dead document, and it's very easy in software development to end up with, hundreds, thousands of hours of work, and all the documents are dead. They're completely irrelevant. We're not on AWS anymore. We moved over to Azure, or, we're not doing NoSQL. That didn't work out well for reporting. So now we have this data warehouse, and the developer's completely unaware of the fact that there's a data warehouse that's, taking the NoSQL data and, making it relational again. And we got this big, huge ETL transform behind the scenes, and no one documented that. Or, worst case scenario, you lose access to everything. And like, let's just say I created production and it's all under my login, and it's up in Azure, and then I leave the company and my account gets disabled, and everything breaks, right? And then everyone's like, what's going on? In that case, documentation could be important. You could come and say, oh, he set it up under himself. That was a mistake. We shouldn't have done that. I wouldn't do that, but
Yeah.
I'm trying to get where I'm going there.
Yeah, I think it's really important because of the fact that I think we all hate the idea of having, like, when you get a manual for a new appliance, you're like, oh, I don't want to read that. Like, I'll just see if I can figure it out by myself. But then when you get into it, you're like, okay, I need to read the manual.
Yeah, I
And
did
I
that
think,
with this. I bought a little light kit, and,
oh
and I
yeah,
thought I knew everything, and yeah, I had to go back. And read the manual because
yeah.
the light was it had like Kelvin readings and change settings, and I'm like, okay, apparently this is more complicated than I anticipated.
Yeah, it's more than a light than I thought it was.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's really important. Like, you think, oh, manuals are so annoying. I don't want to deal with that. And then you eventually like go back to it. Like, whether you're building an IKEA table or you're trying to set up your light. And I think that's pretty much what documentation is. It's just having your manual for the code so that
Yeah.
everyone can see what you did, why you did that, and then be able to make the changes if they need to in their department or something like that.
Yeah, the end user documentation makes a huge difference too, because maybe I'm not using Restream to the best of its capabilities, right?
Mhm.
Maybe there are some features hidden in there that I was completely unaware of. Maybe, you could turn on this flag and it does some certain thing, and the only way I'm going to figure that out is by reading the documentation and going through it and seeing, unless someone does a blog post about it or talks about it
Yeah.
on LinkedIn for some reason. But in general, like, there's a lot of software that you get into and you're using it, and then you're like, am I using this like in the best manner possible, in the correct way, and are there features that I maybe want to take advantage of? And so that becomes critically important there from the end user documentation perspective.
Yeah, I agree 100%. I think all documentation just ends up being like helping you get like I think it helps with productivity, it helps with onboarding. Like, there's so many benefits to it that even though it's annoying, like, it's essential.
Yeah, I think it gets annoying because it gets into that dead document stage
Yeah.
where it's just worthless, and then you're handed this document, and you're like, "What do you mean your database is accessed?" And they're like, "Oh, no, we moved away from access years ago." And you're like, "Okay, but that's not what this says. This says you guys are using an access backend." And
Yeah.
and I'm reading this, and yeah, I'm kind of getting an idea of what you guys were doing in the beginning, but apparently you're not doing that anymore, which is great because access is not awesome for multi-user, but we won't go into access for a minute. But yeah, but the stuff like that. So you want to make sure that your documents are kind of kept more in a live state, and that you give a little bit of time. It doesn't have to be a lot. You just give a little bit of time to updating, to being able to update documentation, because it becomes critical later on down the road, especially as resources are swapped in and out.
Or you hire someone like us and then we do it all for you and get the information that you need, and then you don't have to worry about it because we'll be updating it for you. If you hire us just to do that, then you have an outsource that's already updating it for you, so you don't have to take time for that.
Yeah. That could be critical because I know most developers don't really want to do documentation, and that's okay.
Yeah. Okay, do you think we have time for one more question before we close it out today? Okay, fantastic. So then, are there any tools or software that help in creating effective documentation that you use?
I have to be honest, most of the time I just use templates in Word, and
Mhm.
then go out and kind of research to kind of gather information, then just get that information back into a Word document. Another useful tool from taking the notes perspective is Evernote or OneNote. I'm sure there are systemic documentation tools out there. I haven't seen any that I was like, oh man, this can save me so much time, because it'll scan all the code. And I mean, if you look at a product like Enterprise Architect, it will that's by Spark Systems. It will generate documentation for you, or at least templates that you kind of go in and fill out. At the end of the day, you always end up in Word, and then the Word document always usually ends up in PDF. And I'm not quite sure you there's tools. I'm not aware of tools. I usually do it manually. That's probably something we should go out and research, and then do a little bit of do another video on.
Yeah, I have done a little research when I was just looking into like how we should make a template because I was doing research on what our template should look like as we were creating it. And when I was doing research, I did see some softwares, but it seemed like they didn't go in and like scan your code. It seemed like they just gave you kind of a template that was more
Yeah,
interactive than a Word
yeah.
document, but you still have to fill in everything. I didn't see anything that does like scanning it and then putting in like your comments from your code into a document. I didn't see any of that when I was researching.
And the interesting thing too would be now that over the last 6 months we've had kind of some game changing.
Doggo saying hi.
Yeah, we had some game changing new technologies introduced around like ChatGPT. I
Mhm.
would be interested in seeing if you could feed your domain information and or code in. Well, yeah, you have to be careful about this. I'm not recommending anyone do this without doing some thorough research on this, because we do have the data privacy issue
Yeah.
that's still kind of being decided. I'm pretty sure if you feed information in ChatGPT, it's able to evaluate that information and use it
Yeah.
for
It
other
could it
organizations.
could potentially spit it out for someone else. So be cautious if you don't want it like on a blog post, don't put it through
Yeah.
ChatGPT.
So you got to be careful. But there is some question there that, like, what if I fed ChatGPT all of my source code or pointed it to my GitHub repository and said generate system documentation? Like, what would we get out of that?
Mhm.
And would that be a valid output? And if it is a valid output, that's great. That means that we can do some tooling around ChatGPT and feeding it in code, and then have it kind of spit back out like, okay, here's how the system breaks down. Here's the pieces that I found, the different modules. Here's a list of all your services. Here's a list of kind of what's going on. And, maybe this code looks a little non-standard, so we'll call that out directly. So I think the tooling around documentation should improve drastically if it hasn't already since the last time I looked at it. Like I said, most of the time I'm just grabbing Word templates or that I have saved off from either different projects or from the web, and then just going in and kind of filling it out. And then I use Visio to do diagramming. There's a couple of web tools that I've been looking at recently. The name escapes me at the moment, that seem to make the diagramming a little bit easier. Visio can be kind of, I don't want to say weird. Maybe it's just me, but it seems to take forever.
Yeah.
And some other web-based ones where it's like drag, line. Okay, and then boom, 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 and you're done. And Visio doesn't seem to do that. I spend all my time in Visio like dragging an arrow and connecting it to one side, and then dragging it. Oh, I hit the corner. Nope, no. Okay, go down. Hit the middle, and then then you get all the resize stuff. So I'm
Yeah.
not sure Visio is the greatest tool. And Enterprise Architect has a ton of features. It's just so complicated. Like
Yeah,
that.
yeah.
So that's all. I would consider that one almost as complicated as Visual Studio itself, which can do a
Yeah.
lot of stuff.
Yeah, yeah. It's
Great
it's
tool, but it's
yeah,
all hard to use.
it's great to have a lot of stuff, but a lot of the time when it does and is capable of so much, there is a larger learning curve to getting it in your tool
Yeah,
belt.
like I actually I'd never done this before in a documentation tool or whatever. I actually went out and watched all their videos. I was like, I want to understand how to use this, because I'm probably not using it right. And I went out and watched all their videos, and even after I was done with the videos, I was still like, wow, that can do a lot. But like, two questions. Number one, do I need it to do all that? And then the number two question is it worth, or three, sorry, is it worth the effort? Then the number three question is like, yeah, like is what I'm going to get out of this worth the time and effort? I've seen people spend hundreds of hours on government projects setting up this documentation and EA and showing to the end user, and I don't directly question the product's value, but I question, like, okay, there is no documentation and all documentation, right?
Yeah.
So you got that in between. So you need to find the middle, right? Not this side where we're not doing anything. We're just talking to everybody, which is great. I'm not saying communication is vital. Everyone needs to communicate. Everyone should be more communicative. We should all be working together as a team. We're working for the same company. We all have the same goal: revenue, profit, getting our product out because we think it has value. But there's no documentation, then document everything down to every single line of code, and I'm writing paragraphs about a line of code. That's too much, right? So I think we need to find some little middle ground here where we have the system documented, we have the end user documentation, and we also have kind of the technical guidance document, and that can be a whole scope, right? So you build a technical document and you can include things in there like, this is our expected coding standards. This is, we're going to use camel casing or Pascal casing. When you're doing this type of, don't ever call the database directly from the business layer. I mean, just standard rules like that. And it's good to spell them out too. Don't take a shortcut and not create a service, even though it's going to be passed through, because, we want a service representation for all the business logic that's being done. And even if you're just passing data down to the data access layer, we do want you to go through this. Don't shortcut it and just take the data up front and, kind of break our tiers and that kind of thing. So it can become important for setting up the structure and the expectations for the team, as well as, this is a system we're building and this is what it does.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that was very insightful. I think that was good for our first video this week about documentation, a good introduction so that we can get into more nitty-gritty stuff on our next live show, which will be not tomorrow because it is a holiday for everyone who's in America.
Oh, happy 4th of July for everyone who's in America. America rock.
Yeah. But we will be back Wednesday with a more in-depth look at documentation. So make sure, if you're not already, to be following Bill so you don't miss that live. Otherwise, that's it from us. Join us next time as we explore more tech topics on our Tech Talk with Atmosoft. And remember to stay curious and stay integrated. Are there any ending words that you want to say, Bill?
Just have a great 4th of July for those in America, and those who aren't in America, have an awesome Tuesday.
Yeah. All right. Fantastic. Thank you, everyone. Bye.